Now, I would like to introduce to you our speakers for this plenary session. For our first speaker, we have the Executive Director of the University of the Philippines Resilience Institute, UPRI. This is an institution established to improve the capability of the UP system as an agent of change to formulate and implement advanced academic programs on disaster resilience in the Philippines and the Pacific Rim region. He is a professor at the National Institute of Geological Sciences, University of the Philippines. Ladies and gentlemen, let us please welcome Dr. Alfredo Mahar Lagmay.
Hello. Hello, good morning, ma'am. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so let me just share my screen so that I can, one participant can, okay, I cannot share my screen. How do I share my screen? Or is it shared already?
No, we don't see your presentation.
Yeah, I cannot share my screen. It just says one participant can share at a time.
Maybe Aryan or Trina could help.
Sir, this is Aryan from Cephal Philippines. Kindly click directly the share screen, not the arrow up on the side.
Yeah, I did that.
Once you click.
Oh, there you go. Okay, there you go. Sorry. All right, can you see the screen?
Yes, we can see your screen, Dr. Lagmay.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I just want to take out the... All right, so I'll be talking about human mobility on climate management and lessons from the scientific community. This really derived from more than a decade of experience on looking at disasters in the Philippines, trying to learn the lessons, documenting them, and pinpointing the lessons that we found in each and every disaster. Primarily not to blame anybody, but really to identify the mistakes so that we do not repeat the same in future disasters or in future events. I'd like to start by showing this image from a Brazilian artist. He's quite famous, and this image that you're seeing is an image that went viral. It shows how humans would like to settle in areas that are naturally hazardous. We have on the top part of the image 3 panels showing a river that swells when it rains and then goes back to its normal condition after heavy rains. Humans, if you look at the 3 panels at the bottom, normally you would like to inhabit such areas because of fertile soil and because of water and other very good reasons. And you can see that there would be engineering intervention. They would try to put dikes, straighten up the river, and then build on the floodplains. And what happens is that when it rains heavily, many of these structures, the residential areas, the houses, would get flooded. And that is exactly the same scenario or the same condition that we're seeing now. Metro Manila, for example, has a lot of structures that are in dry areas during summer months. However, during the rainy season, they get flooded because they are in floodplains. So we have here some more examples. I would like to encourage everybody to visit the NOAA website called noaa.ph, and there are hazard maps there in 3D. We partnered with Mapbox so that we can communicate the hazards better. And you will see that development has been prevalent in areas that are naturally hazardous. We claim these areas as our own, but really, these areas are naturally part of the river. I have here one example of an area, which is the University of the Philippines campus, which is comparatively largely undeveloped. And you can see that the flood-prone areas are free from any settlements or structures. During rainfall events, which are heavy, they get flooded and nobody gets disturbed really because, well, at least people don't get disturbed because that area is not settled in by people. Now, disasters are, according to Hagman in 1984, are disasters that are manifestations of unresolved problems of development. I think that this is very, very important to consider because it is true. For one thing, it is true. We have that kind of problem that if we do not change it, will result in increased human mobility and may also result in increased poverty. And at the same time, to top all of our problems, climate change will aggravate it. So you can see here a photograph of Metro Manila that is really densely populated. And I do believe that largely there's a problem here with development planning. And come the time when a natural hazard strikes, like an extreme flood similar to that of Ondoy or even worse because of climate change, or probably a big earthquake or a storm surge event, there will be problems. And it is naturally more difficult to manage disaster risk if the population is quite high. So that will lead to an increase in human mobility, and that is something that we have to resolve as early as now. And we have this kind of problem according to the people who work on the displacement or human mobility. There have been several millions of Filipinos that have been displaced in 2020. And according to World Bank, by 2050, up to 143 million people will have to migrate from climate hotspots to areas with better climatic and economic conditions within the country. So this is a significant problem that needs really to be addressed. This is particularly important in the Philippines because the Philippines is a hotbed for disasters. We are in the typhoon belt. What you're seeing are all of the tracks of typhoons that have entered the Philippine area of responsibility and made landfall. So most of them making landfall primarily in Luzon and in the Visayas region. There's much less landfall events of cyclones that happen in Mindanao. And we also have that problem of earthquakes and volcanism because the Philippines is situated in the Pacific Ring of Fire, where everybody knows, I believe, that there are earthquakes that happen there and volcanoes erupt also in that place. And it's a continuous threat on top of the continuous threat of typhoons that are powerful that make landfall in the Philippines. Climate change, particularly for the hydrometeorological hazards, will heighten the problem. We have droughts, we have forest fires, we have intense typhoons that are projected by scientists to create more powerful cyclones with stronger winds and more intense rainfall that will bring forth bigger floods and more landslides as well. And also a lot of other climate change impacts that are adverse. Many of them have been discussed during the welcome remarks of the ambassador. Now, we have been looking at the exposure of the Philippines in terms of population. We see that there's a lot of affected or exposed people in areas of the Philippines, and ranking number 1 in the flood risk or exposure mapping is Metro Manila. And the exposed population would be for moderate to high hazard is 4,287,858. It's followed by Bulacan, Rizal. We're counting hundreds of thousands of Filipinos who are exposed to flooding with respect to moderate to high hazards. And the list slightly is different for just the high hazard to flooding. But nonetheless, you can see already that more or less the same provinces are in the top 10, with Metro Manila being number 1. Now, these top 10 provinces for landslides are Cebu and Benguet for moderate to high landslide hazards. If we're just to consider the high hazards, number 1 is Benguet and number 2 is Cebu. But 1 and 2 are just an exchange between Cebu and Benguet. And you can see that the exposed populations or people run up to hundreds of thousands. In particular for Cebu, for moderate to high hazard, it's 431,399. We also did it on a nationwide scale. All of these, by the way, are results of the study on the exposure of Filipinos to the different types of hydrometeorological hazards. Again, Metro Manila tops the list in terms of moderate to high hazards to storm surge. Why is this so? Is because Metro Manila is densely populated. Now, so far, I believe that the Philippines has been doing quite well in disaster risk reduction and management. If we look at the World Risk Index, we used to rank number 3. But lately, we are now ranked number 9. So I would like to congratulate the efforts of NDRRMC and all of the agencies, as well as all of the people who have contributed to this effort in bringing down the risk index of the Philippines from number 3 rank to number 9. And if we look at the fatalities per year from the EM.DAT database, there is reason to believe that lowering of or the improvement of the rank of the Philippines in terms of disaster risk is true, because the graph shows or validates what that is. And you can see that starting to 2014, there has been a constant lowering of the number of fatalities up to the present year. So previously, year after year, we had disasters happening with a lot of fatalities every year. Disasters would occur once or twice per year. And then after 2014, magically, well, it's not magically, there's a lot of effort and investment that was put into there. Somehow, from 2014, something happened. And if we look at it closely, there's a box that I put there, a blue outlined rectangular box. And you can see that if we analyze it more closely in terms of disaster risk with the formula of the United Nations, hazard times exposure times flood, hazard being a flood or a landslide or a storm surge hazard, and the exposure refers to populations, and the vulnerability may be due to poverty or probably elderly or persons with disabilities. If you look at that closely, along with the definition of a disaster, according to the International Disaster Database, wherein 10 or more people are reported killed, we can see that there was still some things that we can improve on. Like, for example, in 2018, near 2018, that's the center year, over the span of 1 year, we had 6 disasters if we follow that definition. There was a hazard that impacted a small area, maybe a barangay or adjacent barangays, that killed, that resulted in fatalities of more than 10. Of course, for each of these disasters that I'm referring to, it's really more than 10. So if we look at it, sometime 2018, for about a year, it rose significantly compared to 2014, 2015, 2016. And then in 2020, 2021, we're still looking at that, and we're still trying to study. But overall, if you remember the graph that I showed to you previously, the number of fatalities has really significantly decreased. And that would agree well with the ranking from number 3 to number 9 in terms of the World Risk Index of the Philippines. Now, there were a lot of lessons that we learned from past disasters. The reason why I'd like to bring this up is because we do not want to repeat the same mistakes that we did in the past. If we can only learn these lessons and be able to address these lessons properly, so that we can be able not to repeat the same mistakes, we would significantly reduce the number of fatalities for future hazards. So just remembering and addressing those problems would help a lot in government efforts in disaster risk reduction. I would just like to emphasize some of the lessons from past disasters. Everybody remembers this. We have here a map of Tacloban in 2010. That's the left panel, with the violet color showing the storm surge hazard. And you can see the green dots also referring to evacuation centers. One striking lesson that we learned from Yolanda was that giving absolute values over a relative landscape is not enough. And another is that we must present hazard maps that would anticipate those events that are bigger than what the community have experienced, or bigger than the historical record. What we needed before Yolanda made landfall was that kind of mapping that would be communicated to the people, wherein storm surge hazards are represented in terms of multiple scenarios. One that is small, bigger, much bigger, and a Yolanda-like scenario. And if we would look at that kind of multiple scenarios of a particular hazard, we can see right away that the evacuation centers were in the wrong places. 70% of the evacuation centers were inundated by storm surges. And that could have been prevented, I guess, if there was a good representation of that scenario of storm surge that we know of as Yolanda. And then we also had this event in Pablo, wherein people in New Bataan were transferred to an evacuation center in Barangay Andap. And that was an extremely unfortunate event or activity, because when they got transferred, they were transferred in the worst place possible in that area of New Bataan. Barangay Andap was in a place that was at a high landslide susceptible area for debris flows. And there were a lot of people who died. They were transferred there because of the lack of anticipation of the hazard the real hazard that could happen in that area. So the map that was shown to them was this type of map. It was represented by yellow color, which means low susceptibility of landslide. When they got transferred, they did not have problems because they did not experience yet any flooding event that would be like what they experienced. You're looking at the river at the top right image, and when the floods came in, it was not an ordinary flood. It carried with it boulders, about 20 million cubic meters of rock material, along with the water that flooded that place. And that evacuation center got overwhelmed. And in the left picture, you see that man standing about 3 to 5 meters below that man are the people who died, about more than 500 people who died, who were transferred into that evacuation center. One other lesson that we learned from past disasters, which I think is already in the Philippine Development Plan, is this statement here: appropriately scaled probabilistic multi-hazard maps. To some extent, I was actually referring to these scenarios of hazard maps for storm surge that was needed prior to the landfall of Yolanda. And that term really is called probabilistic multi-hazard mapping. So I'd like to explain what that is, because it's also in the climate change resolution number 1. Number 1, the CCC resolution number 1. It says that probabilistic climate risk assessment is needed, and it's needed for a for doing executing the national climate risk management framework. In simple terms, you might like to think of probabilistic assessments as having a hazard, a particular hazard, being represented in terms of multiple scenarios. Here, we're looking at a hazard map, which is a single scenario, also called as deterministic mapping. But forget that fancy term, deterministic mapping. Just look at it in terms of a single scenario, worst case scenario, largely mapped out from anecdotal accounts of the people. Basically, it's the experience of the people, and the people telling those who produce these hazard maps that this is the kind of worst case flooding scenario that has happened in that area. Probabilistic risk assessment, which can include, or which may include also the climate change scenarios, is multiple. The multiple depiction of scenarios, some that are small, bigger, some that are very big, depending on the amount of CO2 that we inject into the atmosphere. By doing an exercise like this and mainstreaming that information into communities, into the planning and development, into the development plans of the communities, they will be able to plan their community in anticipation of what could happen in terms of the things that they have not yet experienced, and also including climate change impacts, or at least the projected impacts of climate change. Now, just as an example, to anchor the point, here is a single scenario deterministic hazard map showing the landslide hazards, the yellow representing low landslide susceptibility, the green representing moderate flood susceptibility, the violet representing high flood susceptibility, and somewhere in the middle, I hope you're seeing my arrow, the cursor, is the poblacion. That's somewhere in the middle, and radiating from that poblacion are streets with settlements. That's why they're colored blue as well. And the poblacion is situated in a low flood susceptible area. Over the years, probably they've learned that that is the best place to settle in, because there's no big flooding that happens there, or no landslides that happen there. So when we asked those people where the best evacuation site would be, everybody agreed that that is the best place. Of course, that would be the best place because according to their experience, what they have seen in their lifetime, or maybe the stories of their ancestors, nothing has been passed on that would tell them that that place is unsafe because everything is only up to the historical record. And if we look at it in terms of using advanced technologies that would create multiple scenarios, that I mean LiDAR topography or IFSAR topography that's high resolution, and simulating the floods using climate data, rainfall data, we would be able to simulate those scenarios of the future. Some of the scenarios, especially if they're small, would agree with the accounts of the residents of the area. But come the time when the rainfall would be heavier, and especially with climate change, you can see that the floods could overwhelm or would overwhelm that evacuation center. And what happens when they get overwhelmed? When that evacuation center gets overwhelmed, you actually put those people in harm's way. You increase their disaster risk because you put them in an evacuation center. They got exposed from these unknown hazards, at least unknown to them, and you increased also their vulnerability. And if there's a survivor, the survivor will say, that's the first time it happened, which is what we always hear in media. Whenever there's a disaster, there's this constant phrasing of how they would say or how they would comment on the disaster. This is the first time it happened. Ngayon lang kami nakakita ng ganitong klaseng storm surge. That was the highest one. We never expected it. We did not anticipate because it has never happened. That we need to resolve that kind of problem. We don't want to hear that same comment whenever there's a hazard that's going to impact a certain area. Just by doing that, using probabilistic risk assessment, we can plan communities well and make development much better. And planning must be across all sectors. As mentioned earlier, this pandemic, which is a biological hazard impacting all of us, impacting countries all over the world, has also impacted the different sectors such as education, tourism. We all know that it affected the way by which we live. And it's not just for the biological hazards, it applies also for the other hazards, floods, climate change impacts, etc. And planning must be across all sectors. Agriculture, coastal, water, health, forestry, biodiversity, environment, energy, education, name it, tourism, infrastructure, settlement, and mining. And the goal of working with scenarios is really not to predict the future, but to better understand uncertainties and alternative futures in order to consider how robust different decisions or options may be under a wide range of possible futures. So just an example for development planning of a community, which is an actual thing that we did for ADB in 34 municipalities of Leyte and Samar. You can see here the land use plan, the storm surge, the flood, the landslide plans, and their zoning plans for that municipality. Put them all together and you can easily visualize with different scenarios. Like, for example, this settlement. Somewhere here, which is this one, I hope you're seeing the arrow. This one is a settlement area. It's filled with yellow and orange. That is not a good settlement area. And there's another one here that is a settlement area as well, which does not have much hazards. That is a good way to plan a settlement community. And also here we have the agricultural zone. We can see that, it floods. However, it does not flood everywhere. So in flood-prone areas that are going to be affected in the future, maybe you can plant climate-resilient crops, and for the other areas, just normal crops. For tourism, in this landslide mountainous area, it's a bird watching area. You have two ellipses, which you can see is a highly dangerous area. It's red. It's a landslide area. But we also know that landslides don't happen every day, and they are triggered by typhoons. So when there's a typhoon that's incoming, they can pack up, go to the gray area, a gray colored area, which is the safest area nearby. And then when the typhoon is in the South China Sea, they can go back, right away and resume their business or resume tourism activities. That is business continuity, and that is how things should be planned across all sectors for each and every city of the municipality, all nearly 1,700 cities and municipalities of the country. So I'd like to end by saying that for development planning, we really need to mainstream all of these hazard maps that are multi-scenario. There must be probabilistic risk assessment for us to anticipate those bigger events that we have not experienced. And you might want to think of it as climate change impacts. And they may occur in the next few decades. And who knows, they may be occurring already right now. But definitely after 50 years or 100 years from now, if we do not reduce the CO2 emissions and the other greenhouse gases into our atmosphere, global warming will intensify and will strike with really a lot of power in the form of hazards and strike our communities hard. And what will happen is that there will be really an increase in human mobility. A lot of people will be displaced. There will be internally displaced people, and if there's cross-border mobility, then that will be a more significant problem. In order for us to do this, this is the main arguments of the UP Resilience Institute. These are the main advocacies of the UP Resilience Institute. We're doing probabilistic risk assessment, integrating it into the comprehensive land use plans of the City of Manila, Balanga, Bataan. We're doing the drainage master plan of Quezon City. We've helped the Science City of Muñoz in Nueva Ecija, also municipalities in Batangas, 34 municipalities of Leyte and Samar, one city and 2 municipalities in Iloilo, a city in Cagayan, and another municipality also in Cagayan Valley. And we want to mainstream that so that we can do the proper development planning, anticipating climate change impacts. And also, if we are to do that, based on our experience, it's really very, very difficult to do it with one organization or 2 organizations, maybe even 20. 20 organizations. We really have to work together because, as I said, it is really a work that needs to be done not just by scientists and engineers, but it needs to be mainstreamed. We need to establish a culture of safety. We need to understand the mindset of the Filipino people. We need psychologists. We need musicians to sing songs to raise disaster awareness. We need artists to draw and paint so that people will remember and get people to understand what the problem is, not just through words, but through visual material. We have to change their culture because our culture, because we do not want it just to be like with discipline, because discipline is something that perhaps many people do without belief. We need to change that culture so that actions will emanate from the people in the communities. And to be able to do that, because there's really a lot of work to be done, a lot of science that need to be created in terms of knowledge, and we need to communicate. It is important that if we are to work together, if we are to follow the same Sendai framework, wherein we say that it's a whole of society approach, we must be able to work together using open data, because open data builds trust. In science, the Sendai framework also says that we have to have a science-based approach. And when we talk about science, there must be replicability. In order for you or the people that you work with to trust your science, there must be replicability. And that is a fundamental definition of science. And to do that, the data must be open so that they can check, validate, and repeat or replicate the science that you are asking the people to do. So open data, open knowledge, open science, open access is needed to build trust. And with trust, you can communicate better, because without trust, there is no communication that can transpire. I would end there by saying that these are the two main advocacies that we need in light of these constant threats and increasing threats due to climate change, to increase human mobility. And what is needed, we believe, in line with development planning, are probabilistic risk assessments and working together through open data. Thank you very much. I end my talk there. I hope I didn't spill over my time allotment. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lagmay. For us who have questions, you may please indicate them in the Zoom chat, and we will have our experts answer your questions during the Q&A session. Now, I would like to introduce to you our second speaker, the Lord Mayor of Newcastle from Australia, Councillor Natalie Nelmes. Lord Mayor Nelmes, you may now please have the floor.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, Dr. Ko. I'm very pleased to join you from the city of Newcastle, Australia today. We are home to our own CIFAL here. It's a partnership between the University of Newcastle and the City of Newcastle Council. I see that you have already got my slides ready to share. So I will get going into the presentation. I'm going to talk to you today around the strategies we've employed here in Newcastle, working with our partners around creating a smart, livable and global city. But particular reference will be given to how we're looking at addressing climate change through adaptation and mitigation, and obviously policy, and also use the platform of local government to push for real action on climate change at both a national level in Australia, but also leading into COP26 at an international level as well. Next slide, please. So in terms of what we have done at the City of Newcastle in Australia, working with UNITAR through the United Nations and also the University of Newcastle, that partnership developed in the creation of a CIFAL that was to work particularly in disaster risk reduction throughout the Asia Pacific region, particularly around Australia and the Pacific Islands, which, as many of you would know, particularly in the Pacific Islands, face a lot of similar challenges, I would imagine, to the Philippines. So I will talk today about how we made a commitment to the SDGs and how we integrated them into our strategic framework, and how that allowed us, from looking at a global perspective, to actually take actions locally, committing to net zero emissions at a local government level before our state or national governments had done so here in Australia. And also looking at how we then looked at that climate risk and adaptation strategy and overlaid it in a similar way, using the science of the previous presenter in terms of land use planning, in particular to low-lying areas, what sea level rise meant to particularly vulnerable communities, particularly in regard to this discussion today, looking at human mobility and recognising that climate change and disaster, in particular, even in Australia, COVID-19, and those crises and disasters have a disproportionate effect on the disadvantaged members of our community, and what that actually looks like and how we actually move to a more equal footing for all members of our communities and society. And also making sure we were engaging more broadly with a broad cross-section of our communities wanting to take action on really addressing climate change. Being from Australia, and whether you're aware of it or not throughout your networks or in the Philippines, there has been much division at a federal level around what action on climate change looks like, which obviously has a significant effect on our public policy and that national debate that does lead into the agreements that are reached when Glasgow goes ahead. Next slide, please. So as I said, we looked at our sustainable development goals. We aligned them to our priorities for 2030 as a city, and then looked at how we could localise them through those frameworks of the New Urban Agenda, coupled with the true adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, and made sure that all of our local government, our council plans, our city plans were aligning with those priorities. And obviously, we're just one partner in a city, and we do have 3 levels of government in Australia, but we also have community groups and the private sector. So for us, we really built strong partnerships with the University of Newcastle, a significant organisation, obviously within the city, with a lot of depth, particularly obviously in expertise and research. But we also partnered with heavy industry. I'm not sure if you can see behind me when I'm sharing my screen, but as you can see, it is a coastal community here in Newcastle. We're a couple of hours north of Sydney, and we have a very significant harbour here that is home to heavy industry, but it also is home to a significant amount of the world's coal exports. So you can imagine the jobs that are associated in the resource sector that also creates that tension around real action on climate change and what that actually means for the communities that are employed in resource intensive industries. But we also have, being on an estuary that leads into an alluvial valley, we also have significant and increasing erosion effects from what is known as East Coast lows. And we've had significant erosion of some of our beaches through a combination of increased weather events from climate change, as well as interventions that are then needed to protect not only private property, but also public amenity when you are losing beaches. We also have communities that were built several hundred years ago in low-lying areas in the city. And we do have to have plans in place and triggers that then allow us to intervene at different levels, depending on the amount of sea level rise. So we had to refine those city strategies matched with our priorities for SDGs and make sure that we weren't doing it alone. We were actually building partnerships with other levels of government, the private sector, as well as civil society. And then we wanted to make sure that those plans we're putting in place around that our global goals to reach those sustainable development goals were also measurable and achievable, and they weren't just words on a page. That can sometimes happen with strategic planning that isn't actually implemented. And being the closest level of government to our communities in local government, the actions that we take in terms of particularly are not just social strategies, but also social and hard infrastructure really make a huge difference. Next slide, please. Thank you. And this slide is very word intensive. I do not expect you to read it all, but this is just, as I was saying, how we looked at our global commitments and obligations as a city and a municipality. And we went through the process of aligning our SDGs to also our economic development strategy in the city, and picked out 4, 8, 9, 12, 13, and 17 as SDGs really to focus on in terms of alignment with our city's priorities, which were well consulted with our communities. And as you can see, that's around partnering with the goals, taking urgent action on climate change, looking at the private sector, particularly around jobs, so industry, innovation and infrastructure, and the type of resilience in the built environment. Also looking at quality education in terms of not just understanding what is happening in this space, but also making sure we had the skills and the resources needed to actually tackle this challenge over many decades. And also looking at consumption, particularly being in a country like Australia, with a large land mass, notionally smaller population, but very high consumption levels. I'm happy to have these slides shared so you can read them through at your own convenience. Next slide, please. This is where we looked at different models of how we were going to look at the real challenge of this century around the needs of all of us, not just what we need at a city or individual suburb level, or particularly in individuals' needs, in contradiction or juxtaposition of what we need as a global society. And obviously municipal governments, I'm sure, and working in this space for quite some time, there is often a lot of focus on the built environment and hard infrastructure intervention. We also wanted to make sure that we were looking in the social space. And this was the model that we used, and which is known as the donut model. And I thought this was worth sharing to ensure that when you're coming at these big city challenges, these big global issues, that we are looking at it from a multifaceted approach, where we are looking at the ecological ceiling, the safe and just space for humanity, the social foundation, and how we look at those regenerative and distributive economic effects across every member of our society. So I thought this was worth sharing of how we've looked at the different models and how they would then adapt into our strategic planning to make sure they were inclusive. And this is a movement that obviously has been growing in terms of looking at how you actually combine the complexities of dealing with the social challenges and the infrastructure challenges from that quadruple bottom line approach. For us, we looked to examples that locally in Melbourne, which is obviously probably a city that you would know well in Australia, Amsterdam, Philadelphia, and it's all about building that resilience in the community and making sure that everyone has that access to housing, to water, food, health, education, something that I hope that we're all striving for. Next slide, please. And this is how we use that donut model to integrate the SDGs. And this also showed us where we needed to do the work, where we could have been missing in terms of policy and in terms of intervention by overlaying the SDGs, and particularly the ones that we are focused on. And it allowed us to refine our work here at the City of Newcastle, not just from a local perspective, but in the global context, that we all have a role to play in ensuring that we do not only reduce global warming, but we also look at the multifaceted implementation and achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is good for every person on this planet, every person that isn't born yet on this planet, but is also the right thing to do for our environment. Next slide, please. This is quite detailed and I'm happy to share, but this is quite internal to an Australian perspective and our perspective. And we overlaid those partnership goals that I had mentioned and all those different agencies from the United Nations down to the not-for-profit groups that we work with, the different levels of government, and a lot of the economic development work and social strategy work that we were doing. So we looked quite in a very detailed way how to map all of the multifaceted partners that are needed to achieve these goals. Next slide, please. So for us, in terms of climate action, obviously we've acknowledged that there's a climate emergency. We've got a significant commitment to a range of targets and initiatives. And our mitigation strategy is articulated in our climate action plan, and that builds on a lot of work we've been doing as a leader in this space in Australia, in local government, really pushing for those net zero targets of our own operations no later than 2030. And also looking at a citywide goal. So obviously those partners I'm talking about that are out of our control, other levels of government, the private sector, the civil society, that target we've set is 2040. So they are ambitious targets. Next slide, please. These next couple of slides, I wanted to show you how we have just adopted our new climate action plan with those targets and how we're looking to achieve them. For us, we were looking at our energy supply, best practice in terms of energy consumption, as well as waste and water, looking at our own supply chains, which I think has been something that's been only possible through the partnerships we have built. And one of the major areas for us for our internal operations is around our transport emissions. Next slide, please. So for us, this highlights our own pathway. And I think every city, depending on the types of services they deliver, will have a different pathway. But as you can see, we've had significant reduction in our electricity use over the last decade, as well as from street lighting use, as well as water and wastewater. That has been off the back of a lot of work over the last decade to get that consumption down. We were the first city in our state to go to 100% renewables for our own energy supply. And as you can see, this timeline also looks at the timeline of actions we've taken. It's very detailed, so I'll just share it with you. But as you can see, as you move towards 2020 at the end of this timeline, it shows you that the target and the challenges for us in terms of our applications are looking at moving from 100% renewables on the 1st of January 2020. And by doing that, we've actually seen a lot of other local government areas be able to follow that lead. And what has actually happened in Australia is local government has actually been leading the way. We've also constructed solar farms. The solar farm, interestingly enough, was constructed on an old waste management facility, so an old landfill site that usage had been stopped. And prior to that, it was actually a coal mine. So it's the adaptive reuse of that land into using renewables. This actually looks in detail at where our solar PV, and now we're coupling it with battery storage, is through all of our own sites across the city. This is also mapping the city lighting and the transfer over to LED, which is one of the projects we're currently working on. And the continued rollout actually then drops that energy consumption and that usage right across the city. Next slide, please. We've been very proactive at installing electric vehicle charging stations across the city. Australia hasn't had the right policy settings at a national and state level to actually help the take up of EVs. Other countries are much more advanced, but we are obviously pushing from a municipal level to try and ensure all of that infrastructure is in place. Also, at the same time as putting that infrastructure in place, making sure we have solar PV and battery storage. This is part of our next challenges, and obviously, again, the SDGs are bedded into those challenges. And I think I've just talked about some of those, so we can flick to the next slide. This is the supply chain targets that we have set, as well as the net zero emissions targets that we have set across the city. That's fine. We can go to the next slide. Yeah, and the next one, and I can speak to them. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. And this is our pathway to net zero, or maybe, sorry, just the one before, the slide before. Yeah, this is the slide, the one. Thank you, this one, perfect, yes, just there. So what I wanted to show you from that graph is mapping what business as usual would have looked like, as you can see from that line at the top of the graph, and what that very deliberate action actually means in terms of real action that every municipality could do on a pathway to net zero. And I can jump to the next slide. I just thought it's a good graphical explanation of what you can actually do. In terms of adaptation, I thought this actually ties into the previous presentation. From our context, as I explained, there are low-lying areas throughout the city of Newcastle, areas that are going to be affected by sea level rise, and we've had significant erosion events, east coast lows, which are storm events that create flash flooding, and also significant erosion events. Also, as many people would know, Australia has suffered, and we have too here in the city of Newcastle, from significant devastating bushfires. The bushfires tend to surround us more inland from us, but it does obviously have then a flow-on effect to our community. So, for example, in the height of the bushfires 18 months ago, leading into Christmas, before some of the very devastating ones you would have heard of, the sky in Newcastle turned grey in our city, and we did not see proper sunlight or sky for almost 6 weeks. That's quite a long time for us when we're used to good air quality and relatively sunny skies. So it does have obviously then, even though the bushfires weren't physically in our city, we would have ash fall all over the city. And obviously that has obviously population health outcomes and all sorts of other flow-on effects. So everyone across the country, which is a very large country, in some way or another were affected by those significant bushfires. What we have been doing is looking at infrastructure adaptation for those low-lying areas, as well as looking at urban heat island trials. Because we are a warm climate, the more hard surface we have and the less vegetation we have, we can get very, very high temperatures, particularly as you move away from coastal areas in the city. And we're also looking at different social trials for our community members if they can't get access to good, cool, air-conditioned spaces, using our libraries, which are all throughout the city, as areas of refuge. Next slide, please. This maps our city, and as you can see, the darker the colour, the higher the heat island magnitude. And you can see at the top left-hand side of the map, as you get further away from the urban areas, the areas around the water, you can get quite adverse heat effects. And there is a high correlation to, it's very obvious to urban heat island effect and the lack of vegetation. Next slide, please. This is just some of the research that we have done in terms of that graph that you see in front of you. This is again another collaboration to do this work across our pilot sites. And I can share some of the more detailed information because it's a lot to take in one graph there for you. But it is, again, the collaboration that underpins a lot of this work, obviously with the University of Newcastle. Next slide, please. This is one of the more outlying, like non-coastal areas where we've been doing a lot of infrastructure intervention, not just dealing with urban heat island effect alone, but looking how we deal with drainage and also further greening. So curb garden beds, looking at shelter in terms of those roof structures that we call them dragonfly roof shelters, so shelter for community members, and how we can use different painted pavement treatments to actually reduce the effect of urban heat island. For example, in some of these areas we tested that are suburban areas, you can get days in a row over summer that go over 40 degrees, which is a very significant temperature, and these are sometimes often lower socioeconomic areas that don't have access to air conditioning, and there can be risk to life on those hot days. We also introduce a lot more permeable surface into the upgrades we've done in a lot of these local areas. So these are the types of real actions we're taking to deal with the effects of not only climate change, but also the effects that come from having less access to high quality jobs and the effects of populations that don't have the resources like other parts of the population to ensure access to air conditioning and the like, particularly on those hot days. Next slide, please. This is back to the estuaries around the Hunter River, which is obviously also doubles as a very busy port operation. And the mapping that you saw before that was dark in colour, these are all the areas that you can see, particularly it's a bit lighter, it's a purple line. And that purple line indicates all of the density of population, but also with a lot of employment lands that are actually subject to just current and future sea level rise. So they're currently areas where you can see the red dots are areas we've had to already intervene and install pumps to pump water out of as we get king tides or large rain events. We do have to, even without rain, just with a high tide, we do have to constantly pump out water from these areas where people not only live, but also in terms of economic impact, a significant amount of high value jobs, particularly attached to the port operations in these areas. Next slide, please. This is the work that we have done in preparedness in terms of the triggers that allow us then to go and do interventions based on obviously a lot of research, and that's one of our adopted policies at Council. Our strategic position at the moment that we've had to go to is obviously 0.1 sea level rise, where we have installed improved flood gates to all the drainage outlets and the high power pumps that I'm talking about from the low-lying areas. Going up to 0.2 metres of sea level rise, we have to actually then intervene with the construction of a levee. And then if it goes, unfortunately, higher and higher, these are some of the next interventions, which obviously have a significant cost associated with them. So this is some of the real costs of climate change and sea level rise in our city. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, we use our libraries when we have heat waves to allow people to escape there in the cool, and hopefully it stops them from overheating and ending up hospitalised. Next slide, please. Look, we've had a lot of community engagement, particularly around the SDGs, looking at how we respond to the climate emergency, and also looking at how our 2030 vision is actually fit for purpose. And we've been going through a really large consultation process before different lockdowns associated with this pandemic have occurred, and it's been going for over 18 months. And that's very much around our vision for 2040 and embedding our social strategy together with our environmental strategy that actually then can look at how over the next 20 years we plan for the best possible outcome in terms of resilience for and inclusion for all our community members. Next slide, please. So this is the type of engagement we have done. Even a lot of it has been done, had to be moved, some of it has been face-to-face, but obviously some of the challenges with the pandemic, it has been moved online, and we're still going through this process. Next slide, please. These are the types of areas we're engaging in around transport, planning, climate action. Affordable housing is one of the really big areas for us. At the moment here, we've seen a huge amount of people moving out of capital cities in Australia, triggered a lot, I think, by working from home and the pandemic, which regional cities like Newcastle and regional areas have seen a huge amount of property price increases, which then puts more pressure on the members of our community that don't have access to housing and jobs. So housing affordability is really falling out for us in terms of in an area of intervention in terms of government policy that is really needed. Next slide, please. These are the top environmental issues that our community have identified, and obviously we will be working through all of those, particularly in regard to we run waste management and looking at landfill waste management and particularly organics and organics recycling, and the circular economy is one of the other areas, aside from obviously green spaces, trees, planting, and the protection of our coastline. Next slide, please. Again, harping back to the beginning of my presentation, the social strategy and localising that social strategy and making sure that we are including all members of our community. We have deliberately targeted community members from culturally and linguistically diverse areas, lower socioeconomic backgrounds, LGBTQI communities, our Indigenous, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, our disabled communities, and also older and younger people. So it's very deliberate in terms of the way we're engaging, not just with the middle group that often have a voice, to ensure that we have the right strategies in place to deal with all of the multifaceted challenges in the future. Next slide, please. These are some of the work that we have done, and we've done a lot more through digital mechanisms. And I've shared a link there. If anyone is interested, they can click on that link and see some of the types of activities we have done to include all members of our community and then tell that story online. Next slide, please. So again, I think I've made these points a number of times. the social issues, the challenges for us, equity, inclusion, the connection, obviously access to health couldn't be more pertinent when we are all going through this global pandemic together, and obviously making sure we're engaging with everyone in our community. Next slide, please. Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much. Hopefully that gave you some insight into some of the disaster risk reduction work we're doing, coupled with our really strong advocacy and acknowledgement we are in a climate emergency, and then how that translates from global goals like the Sustainable Development Goals, embedding them into our policy processes, ensuring they are embedded with our partners in the city, and then what real action actually looks like on the ground for our citizens. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Fantastic presentation there. The Lord Mayor, Councillor Natalie Nelmes, that was really comprehensive, comprehensive strategies, approach, lens, led by the City of Newcastle to push back the risks of climate crisis. Really very admirable. Now, let us please listen to our third, last but certainly not the least among our speakers in today's session. We have a global expert on the issues of climate impacts, migration and adaptation, and has been supporting countries across the world on tackling climate change. A senior advisor for the Climate Action Network International, let us all please welcome Mr. Harjit Singh.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to be part of this session, and I can see how rich the presentations are, and I'm really glad to be part of it and also share the learning that that we have had through my work engaging with several organizations over the last few years. So I'm going to share my presentation. Just give me a moment. Are you able to see that?
Yes, we can see your presentation.
And is it full screen now?
Yes, it is in full screen now.
Okay, thank you. So, so what I'm going to share is just a bit more of a global perspective. It was really great to hear case studies from various countries. And my presentation is going to talk about the learning that we've had. So I'm based in India, a part of South Asia region. And we've had work in 6 countries of South Asia where we looked at community level issues, we looked at policies, but at the same time, we have also been engaging with the governments at national and international levels, and also influencing the regional policies, particularly in South Asia. Previous presenters have talked about it, but I thought it's important to put that slide because when we talk about climate risks, and especially the way temperature has been rising. So this report from IPCC came in 2018, clearly highlighting how even a ½ degree of temperature rise is going to have impacts going twice from where we are going to see impacts from 1.5 degree. So whether we talk about extreme heat or how marine resources are going to be affected, or there's going to be species loss. And if in case of Arctic Ocean being free of summer ice in summer, it's going to be 10 times worse. So it's really important for us to look at how it impacts. And my previous speakers did talk about the food security related issues. As you can see, crop yield is going to go down dramatically, and we'll also see species loss throughout, and how sea level rise is going to displace communities. So really, and at 1.1 degree of impact, we are already struggling to deal with the climate impacts. And that is the main reason why we see that coping mechanism of many communities failing forcing them to migrate, or because of several impacts, they are being displaced against their wish. So when we talk about climate change, there are multiple risks, be it extreme weather events, which we normally talk about a lot, storm surge or tropical cyclone, drought, heat waves, floods. But then the slow onset events, which we only have begun to talk about recently, and these include sea level rise, but still we haven't talked sufficiently about ocean acidification and the impact it's going to have not only on the marine ecology, but people who depend on the coastal ecosystem, increasing salinization, land and forest degradation, increasing temperature. We've seen heat waves affecting people, loss of biodiversity, glacial retreat, again, of the storage of fresh water, how that is going to affect communities and affect food security. So all those challenges remain. And at the bottom of this infographic, you also find that a range of economic, I mean, they say non-economic, but we would like to characterize them as social, cultural, and environmental impacts which people are facing. Of course, we are far more familiar with the impacts related to the economic losses, so business operations or agriculture production, tourism, infrastructure, and property. But it's also important to start looking at the range of social, cultural, environmental impacts when we talk about human mobility, right? And that's where it belongs. And how loss of territory, loss of cultural heritage, loss of indigenous knowledge or societal identity, and loss of biodiversity and ecosystem services are affecting communities. In fact, there are other disasters that you would not find on this infographic, which is from the UN, which is a couple of years old. For instance, we have seen the role of epidemic, climate change in causing epidemic, or forest fire. So those disasters are also getting exacerbated because of climate impacts. Of course, we have Paris Agreement. I'm sure you all know about it, which is quite comprehensive, which does talk about staying below 1.5 and 2 degree. Of course, in 2015, when the Paris Agreement was reached, it has both the targets of 1.5 and 2 degree. As I presented this slide on IPCC report that came out in 2018, very clearly said that 2 degree is going to be so devastating. As I said, even at 1.1 degree of impacts, it is becoming devastating for several communities, and they are unable to survive and continue to live at those places, which is exactly the reason why they're being forced to migrate. So we cannot even imagine going beyond 1.5 degree, and in case we cross that, which looks like the possible situation if we do not reduce our emissions, it's going to be so damaging for the planet and for people. So it has, the Paris Agreement talks about a number of things that need to happen. Rich countries have to provide $100 billion a year, which is a floor, and there are discussions right now at the UN level how that needs to be updated by 2025. And this particular COP26, is going to have this very strongly on the agenda. Rich countries have to take a lead in reducing emissions, while all developing countries have to make efforts, and how they need to be supported in doing that. And there's also, it's also about burden sharing. It's also about review mechanism, because we cannot just look at the target and forget about it. We have to have a ratchet up mechanism, which is linked to the review mechanism starting in 2023. And last, but probably now, which has become the most important and very relevant for the discussion that we are having right now, is about loss and damage. How we are going to support communities who are already facing those climate impacts, and how we are going to help them recover. Because if communities who are impacted by disasters do not get support in time, they are the ones who are at risk, and who then leave their homes to survive and eke out a living. And I want to present this slide from IDMC, Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. This data is from 2019. How it says that, in fact, if you look at the data from previous years, the number of people who are getting displaced, and mind you, these are new displacements, have increased because of disasters. And within that, the blue ring, you find that majority of disasters are weather related. So out of 24.9 million people who were displaced in 2019, out of that, almost 24 million were displaced by weather related disasters. And that's quite telling. And I should also share the data that came from 2020. And you look at how the numbers increased in 2020. And again, out of 31 million people were affected by disasters, and out of that 30 million. So majority of people who are being displaced are due to weather-related disasters. Clearly, climate change has a handprint or footprint of forcing people to migrate. And this is something that we need to understand. And when we look at the policies, and I'll come to that, that recognition of how climate change is driving migration and displacing communities is still not there. These are the report that came out in 2019, and there were several analyses. It was by Climate Central and IPCC reports, very clearly telling how every other prediction is telling us how impacts are increasing. So millions are now going to be displaced, even who are living in the coastal areas. So I've worked with Climate Action Network now, and have been working with ActionAid as well. So I was there for 19 years. And as part of my work, of course, Climate Action Network and ActionAid, we came up with a range of reports, as I was mentioning in the beginning, in South Asia. These are some of the regional reports that we brought. So on your top left, Climate Change Knows No Borders. We looked at how we need to promote solidarity within the region in South Asia and how it's impacting. We were talking about COVID. So we also looked at how COVID impacted communities. And we looked at how we need to increase the work in terms of policy response, and particularly looking at gender analysis of climate-induced migration in South Asia. And this was based on a series of national reports that we brought out from Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. And these reports really helped us understand the impacts that people are facing, what is missing when it comes to climate policies, how we need to work with national governments, and to make sure that people who are facing displacement and migration are supported through appropriate policies. So let me share some of the learning that we got from these reports and the work that we did in the region. Clearly, climate change is a critical driver of displacement risk around the world. And an important thing is that particularly for the global south, where urbanization has not been very planned and managed, we see the interface between inequality, poverty, and urbanization that has not been planned and climate change really coming together, which is posing a great risk to vulnerable communities. We also see how displacement or migration is triggered by disasters, but it depends on economic and social factors, be it resource availability or social networks or livelihood opportunities. As I said earlier, while we are looking at disasters, extreme weather events, we also need to look at slow onset disasters, which are now, such as sea level rise, desertification, which are now displacing millions, particularly, so of course, in South Asia, but also in sub-Saharan Africa and Pacific regions. Another learning that we have had, and previous speakers did allude to, that how we need to look at future emissions. At the same time, coming from South Asia, I must also talk about population growth and distribution and how effectively we respond even the ambassador said in his opening remarks, how we need to really scale up adaptation action across the board. So clearly, when we look at people who are forced to migrate, there are push factors and pull factors, and I think it's really important to go a little bit detail into when we talk about push factors. Whether there's a climate emergency or not, we have seen how conflicts, poverty, access to land, or lack of access to land, and ethnicity become factors for people who are then forced, because they do find that those reasons are making them leave their home so that they can have better income, or because of the marginalization that they face. And then there are pull factors, because they can earn better income. They go to places to either nearby towns or cities where they have more livelihood opportunities, where they have their own kins, family members living, and they have access to health and other services. But what climate change has done, there are now more push factors, particularly because of climatic disasters, how their land are being swallowed by sea, how they are losing their homes due to frequent and intense disasters, whereas policymakers continue to look at only pull factors. If you listen to the stories of those migrants in cities, you find that somewhere climatic disasters have been a major reason for them to leave their homes. Of course, they are facing poverty, there are issues of land, but climate change is increasingly becoming a factor, and causing a displacement. When it comes to dramatic onset events or extreme weather events, they cause mass displacement. At the same time, we also need to recognize people do go through routine migration, which is then converted into permanent migration if they don't get any support, or their resilience is not increased. And there are also long-term issues that emerge after these extreme weather events. If we do not provide enough support to communities who face disasters, they are the ones who are much more likely to move. And this is where it also connects with the climate action that we are talking about. Many of you may be aware that within the climate arena, we talk about mitigation, emission reduction, we talk about adaptation, which is now becoming a very important aspect. Even the UN Secretary General recently remarked, and now rich countries are also realizing the importance of adaptation, which so far has only been pushed by developing countries. But the third pillar, which is important in this context, is loss and damage. And when I talk about how communities need to be supported when they face these disasters, if we do not have those policies in place from national to global levels, it is going to drive more and more people. So it is linked with the governance issue. It is also linked with the resources that need to be provided. Another learning that we've had, as I already mentioned, that people usually move to the adjacent towns and villages, especially where basic services, when the basic services are no longer available. And we also need to talk about, what happens when people move. And again, this goes back to the previous point that policymakers continue to look at migration as part of development, without recognizing how climate change is driving, or what kind of conditions people are living in when they land up in large urban slums, or how they lack basic services. Another important issue to look at is that in cases where migration is a coping strategy, but women, children, elderly, and disabled people, even they have even fewer options, and they can't even plan their migration. And we need to look at them as trapped communities who, on one hand, do not have resources to move. At the same time, where they are stuck, they do not have adequate resources and basic services. Whereas people who have more social and human capital, they migrate in a planned manner. So really, it is about putting a spotlight on what is forcing them to move, what are the pull factors, who are most affected and how we can support communities where migration is inevitable, and how we look at social and human capital that needs to be supported in this context. Coming to the global aspect, displacement and migration, as you know, has become quite an important issue at the international level. And I'll speak much more about the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, where I've been engaging for several years. So this issue came up much more strongly in Cancun in 2010. And it was recognized that we need to look at various forms of human mobility. And I must mention that in the UN system under climate change, we are talking about displacement, migration, but also planned relocation. Now, this goes back to the previous point that I raised about slow onset events. And the 2019 report, if millions of people who are living on the coast are going to be displaced when their land is going to be swallowed by sea, or people in Africa, for instance, facing desertification and the area is not livable at all, what do we do? In those situations, we have to go for planned relocation. And now even Paris Agreement mentions that we have to support communities in planned relocation. So one good thing that we have seen under the UN system, that the entire spectrum of human mobility has been recognized. Not only we talk about displacement, migration, planned relocation, but also about internal migration and cross-border. So after we got the discussion started in 2010, various summits and meetings have advanced the agenda. So Paris Agreement, as I said, does recognize the rights of migrants by also it established task force for displacement, which then came into being in 2016 and 17, which developed its work plan, and I come to that. During that time, after Paris Agreement, we also saw how the global community was looking at various dimensions of displacement and migration. As you know, in 2016, several nations came together, adopted the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants, and that led to several processes. And eventually, in 2018, we adopted the Global Compact on safe, orderly, and regular migration, but also for refugees and for refugees as well. At the same time, there has also been a process of platform for disaster displacement that has been going on, which is working closely now with UNFCCC, and it's now part of Task Force for Displacement. So if you look at how that's what I was referring to in terms of issue of loss and damage, this is where the issue of displacement is housed. So there is Warsaw International Mechanism that was achieved in 2013. The discussion on loss and damage started much more strongly in 2007. So in 2013, we achieved Warsaw International Mechanism, and this is where the discussions on displacement are happening, and that's under Warsaw International Mechanism. Several committees have been established, including the Task Force for Displacement. And that mechanism looks into various aspects. So apart from displacement, migration, and planned relocation, it also has expert groups on slow onset events, non-economic losses, action and support, comprehensive risk management that I am also part of. Now, what Task Force for Displacement has done, once they were established, and it represents international organizations such as International Organization for Migration, UNDP, and also International Displacement and Monitoring Center, and several other UN agencies that have been working on this very issue. And they submitted their, they report to the Executive Committee of the Warsaw International Mechanism, and their recommendations were accepted, and I'm going to share that. And also their mandate has been extended, which means that they are not, so when the mandate was established in 2015, it was limited. It was only to provide them the guidance to the executive committee and Warsaw International Mechanism, but that has been extended, and they are now in the process of implementing their plans, as I said, by various agencies. Now, to look at some of the recommendations which are important in this context, the work that happens in countries. So as I said, they cover the entire spectrum from migration, displacement, planned allocation, but also internal and cross-border. They talk very strongly about strengthening coordination, coherence, and collaboration across various bodies and conventions at the international level. How we need to provide support to countries. So we have heard several examples, but how the international system can support them in risk assessment and improving standards, and particularly data collection, so that internal and cross-border migration can be understood. The recommendations also talk about formulating laws, policies, and strategies, and how we strengthen our preparedness. It also refers to the need for increased support in terms of finance, technology, and capacity building. Again, this being a new issue, and the way developing countries are facing the crisis, they need support in terms of finance. There was also a very important recommendation that came, how we need to look at this issue from an international perspective, because various agencies are looking at migration and different aspects. How do we have a system-wide review so that we have better coherence? So in terms of elements of their work plan, so they are looking at how the documents that are there or knowledge products can be easily understood by policymakers, as well as citizenry and civil society organizations. So we need user-friendly versions. We need case studies, like what we heard from Australia. So how we can learn from each other, how we can promote national laws and policies and raise awareness. We also need to look at the economic impacts of displacement. As I was saying, so far we see migration as part of development, but when there is displacement, there are also economic impacts of all kinds. We need to exchange information, provide capacity building. How do we integrate the risk of displacement throughout our policies using various tools, and how we need to look at accessing existing funding, but also increase resources. So this is where, as civil society, we continue to fight so that we have more resources for developing countries to respond to climate impacts and prevent distress migration. Now, this is my last slide. So this is also in a nutshell what we learned from our work in countries. So there is a need for clear definitions. There has been progress at the international level, but still at the country level, it's quite blurred. And we need to talk much more about it so that national governments can adopt. They still need to recognize how migration is increasing and how we need to ensure that people's rights are protected. We need to enhance resilience. Again, we heard from previous speakers on how we need to increase our work and scale up our adaptation efforts so that we have strong policies, and particularly with participation of people. Another aspect that we also demand that we have to provide universal access to social protection measures, and that's where we refer to equitable access to education, employment, training, and healthcare. And also there are unconditional cash transfers that are needed for people who are facing climate crisis, and how that system also looks into maternal care and child protection schemes and so on. So there are also situations where migration is inevitable. So how do we look at safe, orderly, and dignified movement? And we also, as the global community, have to provide financial resources to help address displacement and forced migration. And coming from the region where we have done a lot of work with countries and the regional governments, we also feel that we need to promote the sense of solidarity and responsibility. Because within the region as well, we know that majority of migration or displacement happens within the country, but there's a small fraction that does cross borders. And they first go to their own region. So how do communities get protection when they are forced to cross borders? And that's where solidarity and promoting empathy, sympathy are extremely important. At the same time, identifying how we can protect their human rights and promote those and provide legal protection for those who are forced to cross borders. Now, this is an area where we still need to do a lot of work on how to provide social as well as legal protection to communities crossing borders while supporting developing countries and promoting policies for internal migration.
Oh, yan yun. Doon tayo lalabas.
Thank you very much.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Mr. Harjit Singh. That was a wonderful, comprehensive way to provide a broad spectrum. I think we have a complete broad spectrum on dealing with, in your language, decent, safe, human mobility on climate risk management. At this point, we are now open for questions and insights from our participants. We will now call back our experts, Dr. Lagmay, Lord Mayor Councilor Nelmes, and Mr. Harjit Singh. Participants are free to use the Zoom chat to send in their questions, or probably they may use the raise hand feature and wait to be recognized. Thank you to all our experts for today and our participants for their insights. Meantime, I'd like to call Katrina Guanyo to take over the Q&A portion. Again, thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kwan. Of course, thank you to our experts for sharing their presentations and their experiences. It's very interesting and enriching to have our experts from the scientific community, a leader, of course, from the government, and also an expert from the international community to share their expertise and experience in this platform. So let me just go over quickly some comments in our chat box. So some of our participants have expressed that they appreciated, especially how Dr. Lagmay shared the strategies that the UPRI Resilience Institute can share with the government, probably the local government and even the national government. Also, our participants have commented that they think that the strategies of the city of Newcastle is indeed a model for other local governments as well. And they also shared appreciation, of course, to Mr. Singh for a very comprehensive discussion on how human mobility and climate risks are managed and represented in the international discourse. And so now, just to keep the ball rolling on our questions, we also have questions from our participants. So one of our participants asks Dr. Lagmay, they said that knowledge and education is very important when it comes to disaster risk reduction and resilience. And so they just want to know whether there are available maps accessible to the public, just so they know the proper disaster risk mapping for their local governments.
Yes, we recently relaunched the NOAA website. It's called the revamped NOAA website. It's got multiple scenarios of storm surges that are of high resolution nationwide. For landslides as well, high resolution, 5 by 5 meter pixel resolution, or maybe 10 by 10 meter pixel resolution, nationwide as well, and about 60 to 70% flood maps for the entire country. It's in 3D. We partnered with Mapbox for that, and it's all for free. Now, if there are maps that need to be used, we believe in open data. In 2017, we made all of those maps available freely without any conditions. In the sense that it is really open data. You don't have to we don't have to ask any questions. You can just download it, right click, and they're available in bulk without any conditions. For the climate change scenarios, those were not part of the NOAA program. So we've been doing it on a municipal or city basis, depending on who engages the UP Resilience Institute and the NOAA Center. And we create climate change scenarios for those. The amount of rain that we use to generate all of these scenarios come from a rainfall record, a climate record from the Weather Bureau Pag-asa. We translate that. There are some articles that we wrote. One co-authored, the editors are Juan Polihin and Rajiv Shaw. And one of those chapters give a description on the methodology of how we translate the climate change impacts into future scenarios using the climate data that are available. So that is it. For the climate change scenarios, we do it on a case-to-case basis, but for a nationwide scale, for landslides, storm surge, for the business as usual scenarios, they are all available, including floods, but it's only 60 to 70%. We hope to be able to finish it during the program before that was funded under NOAA, but somehow it ceased in 2017. But we are still continuing it. We're still maintaining the website to make all of those data sets available. Many have downloaded them already. Terabytes upon terabytes of maps in ArcGIS format and KMZ format are all available for download in that website.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lagmay. I think my colleague has shared the link to the NOAA website, and maybe we will also share that in our Trelio community. You can access that, and as Dr. Lagmay said, it's free and open to the public. We also have a question for Lord Mayor Natalie Nelmes. One of our participants asks, what can you advise or maybe suggest for countries or maybe local and both national governments as well as some industries who are beginning to recognize the climate change risks that they are experiencing? Maybe the participant is asking how we can jumpstart the efforts.
So for us here at the City of Newcastle, depending on where you are and the structure of government, my advice to you is if your national government, your federal government, hasn't been quick to sign up to net zero or COP26, or hasn't even adopted the Paris Agreement, which is pretty light on, what we have done in Australia is actually band together at a municipal level at local government. And there's over 500 council areas across the country of Australia, and there's a national association. And what we have done leading up to COP26 in our advocacy is actually say, well, obviously, particularly if you're looking at those global targets that then filter down, we've actually tipped it a bit upside down and done it through local advocacy, and basically said to our federal government, if you agglomerate all of the actions and the climate action plans and the risk mitigation plans and the disaster resilient plans of all the municipalities or the local government areas, and make them just your national target, in Australia, you would currently reach about 90% of the Paris targets. So there is a lot of action at a local level. So I would encourage you to go through your municipality, who would often be partnering with, if you've got a local university or you have access to a CIFAL, and just make sure that at a local level they've signed up to obviously Paris, but then obviously what's going to happen at Glasgow. We've signed up to a number of things: the City's Race to Zero, the Global Covenant of Mayors. And if you can do that, you can actually sort of go around your provincial or state government or your national government if they're not taking real action on climate change. So there's the advocacy that you can do, and there's lots of different groups you can do that with. Also civil society that then puts pressure on decision makers like myself at a local level to actually adopt those targets. But there's also the real impact in your local communities. And that's making sure that there is adaptation and mitigation policies and discussions, because the lead times for the infrastructure for those types of policies are long. Infrastructure delivery is a long lead time and it's expensive, and getting funding for it. So there's sort of a two-pronged approach would be my advice.
Thank you so much, Councillor Natalie Nalmes. I think what's interesting in the sharing of Dr. Lagmay as well as Lord Mayor is that we are laying the groundwork in order for us to really ensure that we are building disaster resilient communities and we are able to manage disaster risks. So actually we have another question, and this one is directed to Mr. Singh. So the question is, could you share mitigation or displacement adaptation strategies for slum and urban areas?
So,
yes, Mr. Singh.
I think, as I said in my presentation, when you look at the global south, a lot of urbanization has not been planned. And this is the biggest challenge that we have. And where you find slums, they are mostly low-lying areas or vulnerable to various kinds of disasters. And this is what happens when people moving from rural areas, they end up living on the floodplains and areas that are highly vulnerable. And because, as I said, it's not a planned urbanization that you see in most parts of the global south, that poses a massive challenge. And there are situations where those slums have been regularized and a lot of development work has happened. But unless and until we look at the root cause, unless, if the slum is in a floodplain, that is not a long-term solution. And we have also seen situations where some of these floodplains, or when you look at the peri-urban areas, these are important to be maintained to ensure that cities are not flooded. So we need to look at it in a much more comprehensive manner, that where people who are coming to cities, and I'll go back to my same phrasing of push and pull factors. First, we need to look at what is pushing people to migrate and how we can increase their resilience so that we don't see that exodus. Because we can't only look at cities and say we are going to protect, because if there is a massive influx of people to cities, and we are talking about regions that are highly and densely populated, you cannot manage that problem. So we have to look at the entire spectrum from the source as well as destination where they land. And of course, I'm not saying that we should not be welcoming migrants. We know that migrants have made a massive contribution to the economy. In fact, they are the ones who are subsidizing the cost that we pay for various services, and still they're not recognized. So the governments have to be absolutely sensitive to and much more responsible in terms of protecting their rights. So looking at their role in the economy and provide them dignified space to stay. So if we look at it from a much more holistic perspective, where they have a contribution to the urban economy, then they also have a right to safe housing, shelter, as well as basic services. Slums and upgrading slum may not be a long-term solution, as I said, because these places are mostly highly vulnerable to climate impacts and other kinds of disasters.
Thank you very much, Mr. Singh. I think we are short of time. I hate to cut this short, but I'd like to thank all of the questions raised by our participants. We will address some of your questions. Maybe we can relay some of them to our experts so they can address it at a later time. But for now, we have to conclude this our plenary session. I just want to say that learning from the perspectives of three people coming from different backgrounds, but having the same objective on managing the risks of climate change as well as addressing human mobility as well. It's very important that we gather this perspective, get this perspective, and maybe really push forward the agenda for comprehensive, holistic, and of course, a whole of society approach towards addressing and managing climate change and its impact. So it's worth noting that, as we always say, of course, people move as a response to or in anticipation of climate risk. And these movements may be voluntary or forced, permanent or temporary. And while people move due to slow onset and sudden onset events, it is important to note that climatic and environmental factors interfere with other drivers. So, in a very enriching discussion. It's great to have, of course, Dr. Makar Lagmay. Of course, we also have Councilor Natalie Nelmes and Mr. Harjit Singh. It's such a pleasure to have you this morning. We hope you also enjoyed interacting with us, and I hope to our participants, we hope you learned a lot from this discussion. We still have another session this afternoon, so I hope you will be staying with us until we conclude the conference officially. So once again, thank you so much to our experts. Thank you so much to our participants.